Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to moderate. I'm very excited about this discussion, and we have just an amazing panel this evening. So I'm going to introduce the three speakers in the order they'll speak. And so our first speaker is Professor Bruce Misrock from Rutgers University, my colleague in New Brunswick. He is in the economics department. He has held appointments at Boston College, the Wharton School, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the Stern School at New York University. He is founder and editor of Studies in Nonlinear Dynamics and Econometrics, so he's very well qualified for the discussion this evening. And he is the recipient of many honors and awards and is a prolific publisher of academic papers. He's recently the recipient of a grant from the Director of National Intelligence, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activation Grant, just last year, I guess. So welcome, Professor Misrock. Our second speaker is William Cohen, an author and journalist. William was a senior Wall Street investment banker for 17 years at Lazard, Ferrers & Company, Merrill Lynch, and J.P. Morgan Chase, also obviously very well qualified for the discussion this evening. He is a New York Times best-selling author of 3 nonfiction books about Wall Street, including How Goldman Sachs Came to Rule the World, and was the winner of the Financial Times Business Book of the Year Award. He also has a new book just out called The Price of Silence, which is on the Duke lacrosse scandal, which sounds very intriguing. He is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and writes weekly columns for Bloomberg View. He has also been on numerous occasions on CNN, MSNBC, on Jon Stewart, The Daily Show, The NewsHour, and The Charlie Rose Show. And our third speaker is David Trout, professor of law and justice at Rutgers School of Law in Newark. David is the founding director of the Rutgers Center of Law in Metropolitan Equity called CLIMB, is that correct? He founded CLIMB to provide a resource for the challenges of municipalities and families trying to sustain middle-class outcomes amid growing fiscal constraints and demographic change. So as I said, an outstanding panel for this topic this evening. Professor Trout is a frequent contributor to periodicals such as Politico, Huffington Post. He is the author of a new book, Price of Paradise, and is a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School. So with those introductions, we'll begin with Professor Misrock. Thank you.
Raise the screen while they're talking. They're showing slides while they're talking. I can't hear.
Hello, everyone. Rhoda may be upset about the Nets game, but I think timing this particular forum at around the time of the publication of Thomas Piketty's book turned out to be very good luck, and I'm going to certainly make use of a lot of the information that he and his co-authors have put together. So just to give you the 1,000-mile view first, there are several different types of inequality, and I've tasked myself with maybe putting together just mostly facts for tonight's discussion, and I'm not sure exactly where the follow-on speakers are going to go, but I hope you'll at least take this away. And even if you find Piketty's book a bit dry, and certainly his policy prescriptions unrealistic, you'll at least get something out of the data. The presentation is also available to anyone who'd like to have it, and anything that you see in blue hyperlinks to something real, and you can actually study and analyze this data yourself, which is what I'd recommend. Now, from the 1,000-mile view, I would start with the fact that we want to talk about income inequality, and we also want to talk about wealth inequality. Those could be very, very different things. We could write down both theoretical models and also talk about societies where those things are in fact distributed very differently. I'm going to talk about both. I'm going to present U.S. evidence as well as international evidence, and I'm also going to talk a little bit towards the end about some of the policy prescriptions that have been recommended. And I'll also talk about the thing that conservatives would probably most want us to talk about, which is to talk about mobility among the unequal and the have-nots in all these categories as well. So income mobility, wealth mobility, as well as international mobility among those two categories. And when we start to think about inequality and the things that have been thought about in the past, what we'll realize is that the inequality that we're facing now is very, very different than the inequality that we might have talked about in the past. And I think these facts will help you put them together. So here's a story that probably most are familiar with. This has been talked about in a wide variety of contexts, and it's the fact that the median household income in the United States is falling. They talk about the bad economic performance that Japan has been having over the last 20-odd years or so.
Yeah, we need to put those things on. Yeah, give it a shot. Let me get it.
and they call it the lost decade. Well, the United States has certainly followed them. And at least if you're looking about household income in the United States, we're talking about the lost 2 decades. So household income, the median household income in the United States is actually lower today than it was back in 1989. That's a long time, and certainly contrary to various mythologies that are told about the United States. Better? Okay, good. Good, thank you. Okay, so next, let's see. There we go. So what follows from this is, of course, that something must be happening to the composition of income. And as this particular graph, I recommend Fred to all of you data junkies out there. It's the place to get graphs for your lecture in a few minutes for a talk like this. We see the declining share of labor income in total income. This is a consequence of falling wages, which were behind the slide that I showed you at first. And of course, the record rise in profits. So we've had a very, very slow recovery from the recession from the point of view of labor, a very, very quick recovery, and in fact, up to record heights for corporate profits. And the income growth, importantly, has been concentrated most heavily amongst the 1%. And there's actually sort of 4 groups that you'll have to follow here. I'll talk about medians, which are just where are 50% of the families above and below. I'll often talk about, for example, the bottom 10%, but this is also focused not only on the upper 1%, which you've heard so much about. That was the talk of the movement, the Occupy movement, but it's really also a story about the 0.1%, the upper 1% or upper 10% of the upper 1% who have been getting the majority of the gains. And so here you see it most strikingly. Here we have the income share of the top 1% and the income share of the top 1/10 of 1%. And what you see is that almost all the gains that have been enjoyed by the 1% are in fact being enjoyed by the upper echelon of that 1%. So those folks are in fact enjoying almost all the gains. And at this point we begin to start to talk about then maybe a countable number of folks and so on. You've heard all the various anecdotes about how the Walmart family, for example, is worth more than I think the bottom 50% of the United States. Well, that's what's being reflected in these kind of graphs. So where is the income coming from? Well, it's not just the Walmarts. It's of course coming from the financial services sector, not surprisingly. It's coming from Hollywood actors and superstar sports heroes and so on. But really it's a story about executive compensation, whether we're talking about financial services or whether we're talking about industrial companies that make up the Fortune 500. These folks are dramatically out-earning the folks that work for them. And these ratios have just gone up to astronomical levels. And when you look at the international evidence that I'm going to talk about later in this discussion, you're going to see that these are not reflected in the same way in Europe. Simply not the same type of inequality among top incomes as we see here in the United States. And I should pause as I click through this. Just feel free at any time to stop me for questions. I prefer to work that way. Well, so when it comes to talking about compensation and how well off a family is, I'll show you when I start to do some international comparisons that maybe the United States on a pure income level doesn't look so bad. But on the other hand, then lots and lots of folks in the United States may be earning more income, but they have to pay for their own health care, for example. So doing these international comparisons is difficult. And maybe you don't even, if you want to do those kind of comparisons, look at income. Maybe you want to look at things like life expectancy and so on. And you know what? The United States is not doing particularly well there either. Okay. So here's labor mobility. Not as much mobility as maybe you might have expected. And it's also gotten worse. So now let's turn in this first group here to wealth for the United States. This is actually work done by a co-author of Piketty's named Emmanuel Saez, who's at the University of California at Berkeley, the recent winner of the John Bates Clark Medal, which is for the top economist under the age of 40. Piketty and Saez are responsible for most of this difficult data work that's been done over the last decade and a half or so on putting together pictures like this. So not only then are we looking at something that's pretty hard to compute, the upper 1/10 of 1% wealth share for the United United States. We're also looking at doing these things all the way back, for example, to World War I, depending on how far back we can go with the data. I believe the data begin right at that point, because that's when we begin to have some income taxation in the United States. So nonetheless, you see again that the upper 1% share has reached the level back of the roaring 20s, and that's the kind of inequality that we're talking about when it comes to wealth distribution in the United States. It's very much like things were about 80 or 90 years ago. And what Piketty would have you believe, and I'll leave it as an open question for tonight, is that this particular period right here is actually the aberration. It's the middle of the century when, in fact, there was a move towards more equality in the United States as well as Europe that is, in fact, the aberration. Piketty would have you say that we're just simply returning to the normal circumstances, returning to the Gilded Age. There's a little bit too much of a Marxist flavor in his discussion, in that it seems, in his mind, somehow inevitable, and I don't view it that way at all. But nonetheless, it is useful to think that maybe this period here is actually the aberration. So merely rich is, of course, not enough, and so this is the top 1% less the top 1/10 of 1%. And these guys are, in fact, sort of stable. That's the point. I mean, they have not done it. It is hedge fund managers. It is, actors and actresses. It's really, really a countable number of individuals that can be responsible for a large percentage of this inequality. So this is just showing you the composition of wealth among various different forms. This goes to your earlier question. Certainly when we're doing wealth comparisons, we're looking at things like pensions and so on, other forms of compensation. Income, it's a little bit more difficult to calculate. You can see the housing decline and a little bit of the housing recovery even in this data. And you can also see the, for example, the declining role, for example, of sole proprietorships. They were an important source of wealth in the early part of the century, not so important today. And so this is just telling you that that while there are Bill Gateses and so on affecting these numbers, and maybe Steve Jobs affecting those numbers, the idea then that there are a bunch of small proprietors who've done really well for themselves and need to be shielded, for example, from the estate tax, as Republican rhetoric is implied, simply doesn't exist in the data. It's a fiction, just like the small farmer. This gives us some information then on wealth mobility. There's a lot of stuff to look at. But basically what it's showing you is the probability then of remaining in a particular decile. Hopefully this will refocus in a second. The key number here is that 43% of the people that are in the bottom are going to remain in the bottom over a generation. And if we look at the top, there's also almost a similar stickiness. 40% of those at the top are going to remain at the top. So there's not much more mobility when it comes to wealth than there is with respect to income, even though, of course, any individual's random probability of remaining here is then only 40% per generation. So by the time you get down to 3-4 generations, sure, individual fortunes are going to dissipate. And the folks that were rich, 2 centuries ago or a century ago, like Carnegie, we don't hear of too many more Carnegies. They're running delis now. So let's go outside the United States now. Well, this is another valuable source. I apologize for not hyperlinking that. I thought that I had. There is a large project based in Europe called the Luxembourg Income Study, which is doing the kind of work that I've shown you for the United States, but of course doing lots and lots of international comparisons. And what this particular graph is showing you is the growth since 1979 among the various different income quintiles. And as you can see, the United States still maintains a small advantage in these lower quintiles, relative at least to these 3 other countries. But as you'll see on my next slide, other countries are indeed catching up to our bottom 50%. So the idea of being the lucky to be born in America, again, the data are not supporting the rhetoric. So this is from Dave Leonhardt's new project at the New York Times called Upshot. And what it's just showing you is as we go from the 80s and going in here in 4 or 5 year slices, as you can see, even in the bottom, basically the very, very bottom of income classes here, the United States was near the top, but as you go progressively in increments forward up through 2008 where the data end, by that point then the bottom 50% in the United States are in fact no longer as well off as folks in either Canada or Netherlands. And if you want to also look outside of income, it's not reflected in these slides. The United States once enjoyed an amazing advantage in higher education. It used to be that many, many more people in the United States went to college than other countries. You know what? The Netherlands passed us. Okay, college is expensive, and lots of people, even though they think they should go, are going. We're just haven't grown in about 25 or 30 years, while Europe has continued to push ahead. So again, another advantage in my business in which the United States seems to have fallen a bit behind. Pretty well on time, so let's slow down a bit. Okay, so a little more in the way of international evidence. Again, a long-term, century-long comparison. A lot of stuff in this particular graph. Where I would draw your eye to, if you don't mind, is again this period beginning sort of at the end of the 1970s, in which U.S. Income inequality begins to rise. So this is the income share of the top 1% in various Western countries. And again, as we proceed into the policy discussion tonight, and the things that folks here and perhaps elsewhere have recommended as ways to maybe address this rise in inequality, we have to take account of the international evidence. And so as you look at this particular set of lines, the UK has basically followed our trajectory. So countries that have moved towards lower taxation and more free markets like the UK and the United States have seen a rise in inequality. But then if you look at countries, for example, like France, which has maintained high marginal tax rates, and Sweden, for example, which has also maintained high marginal tax rates, you see that they're not showing this dramatic rise since the mid-70s like the other countries towards the rise in inequality. And certainly that's going to be a component about it. Anyone who's going to tell you that we are going to have trickle down, or that we simply can have a situation in which all boats rise at an equal level, is not looking at the facts, is not looking at the evidence. This is going to require redistribution of wealth and income, whether that's politically possible or socially desirable. I'll leave up to this group tonight to decide. So as we look further again on the inequality levels, United States and Australia topping this particular list. This is the percentage increase in the share of income of the richest 1%, just reminding you from some earlier points that much of the gains in recent years have been going to the richest 1%. Sorry. Here's trends in income inequality. This is showing you the share of national income going to the richest 1%. And as you go across now a wider range of societies, not just those in Europe as well, but also include Singapore for comparison, movements towards more inequality almost all across the board. But again, nothing as dramatic in, say, Spain, France, Norway, as there is, for example, in the United States. This has been not a purely U.S. phenomenon, but it is largely a U.S. as the outlier in terms of the data. So global wealth, nonetheless, has reached an all-time high, and we should be happy about this, I think. Rhoda had me here, I think, a couple of years back to talk about carbon, and greenhouse gas emissions and some other things that I worry about in other parts of my life. But so, yes, the growth of income is something that capitalist societies are wont to do, and wealth tends to rise along with it. And so overall, particularly in a world where there are folks who don't have enough, it still seems to me that this is a good thing. But again, we're here to talk about distribution. And the inequality of the distribution, is perhaps like it was back in medieval times, when you have things like the 85 richest people on Earth having the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the population. So again, we could fit 85 people into not even this entire auditorium, the front rows of this entire auditorium. They would have more wealth collectively than the bottom half of the population. Well, probably they'd come here with a security detail, so we couldn't get there. Okay. So onward, European wealth shows on average, richer societies and the richer European countries relative to the United States. The United States actually fares well when we look at average income. And again, here's another situation in which medians and averages diverge from one another. I'm I'm not here to do an undergraduate statistics lecture, but the important point here is that if you have an unequal distribution of something, that's when you have a big divergence between averages and medians. So for example, we could have a society where almost all the wealth resided with one individual and could result in a very, very high average if that person had a lot of wealth, and almost everybody else could have nothing left, and that would then be shown by the lower median relative to the lower median, relative to the median. And that's exactly what we see in the United States when we do these international comparisons. This is from Piketty's book, not the best graphic, but hopefully you can see it. What you see here is the movement over time of U.S. inequality relative to Europe. Again, a more distinct rise in the United States than in Europe. And then finally, a little bit here, not quite finally, but nearly finally, a little bit about mobility. When we look at global wealth inequality, there was about a 36% chance of being in the same wealth quintile in one generation. That's a little bit lower than the United States, but not substantially lower, and 31% after 2 generations. So you can see it starts to, again, dissipate over time. But nonetheless, this is more than enough time for the wealthy to exercise their power and do what they can to change laws, change income redistribution, change wealth redistribution in a way that might perpetuate their gains. Okay, so let me move towards the last bit of my presentation to talk about some explanations for what's going on, and perhaps also pose some questions for both the audience and my fellow panel members. First, why is a disproportionate share of income and wealth going to the top 1%, 1/10 of 1%, not just the top 10%? So if we had gathered together sometime, say, in the 90s, after coming out of not this recession and not the recession before that, but the recession before that, some of you, as I look out in the faces here, are old enough to remember books like The Deindustrialization of America, and talks about how, in fact, the middle class was being wiped out by the loss of manufacturing jobs and so on. And the lesson that everyone absorbed from that is that we either had to go to college and learn how to write code, or we had to just start selling things on eBay or something like that, whatever lessons were absorbed. But these lessons seem to be different. These are folks who all went to college, as Paul Krugman's pointed out in his review, a more extensive review of Piketty's book in the New York Review of Books, which I recommend. He says, well, the typical high school teacher has the same amount of education as the typical hedge fund manager. So it's not a question of disparity of education. Well, we have lots and lots of well-educated people that are not. Maybe they're two college teachers, 2 high school teachers, at least in my town, could probably make it into the top 10%, but they're certainly not making it into the top 1/10 of 1%, and certainly not when it comes to things like wealth. Okay, so then the question is, what, if anything, and I would put it out there as anything. I think that you still have to, it is not an automatic answer in my view, especially when you think about the welfare criteria that are considered in economics. And in economics, we take as a welfare criterion something known as Pareto efficiency. And this says we have to only consider redistributions in which everyone can be made better off while no one is made worse off. So before you start doing non-Pareto redistributions, which certainly lots and lots of folks are advocating, including, as far as I can tell, the Obama administration, you've got to make your case. So I would still take as the null hypothesis that you've got to make a case for doing something other than that it just happens to offend your sense of liberal justice. So, so some partial answers. What Piketty's book emphasizes is that the rate of return on capital is faster than the growth of the overall economy, and if we're in an economy like that where the returns to capital income are exceeding the returns to labor income, we're going to see a rise in inequality. So certainly that theory fits the facts. The question is whether the evidence fits that theory. We can save that for a bit later. I've already mentioned the point about education. And Piketty recommends a, I think, rather unrealistic solution, which is to have global wealth taxation. We all know why the wealth taxation would have to be global. Where do you think the majority of hedge fund incomes are earned? They're not earned in the United States. They are not subject to the carried interest rule, which you've probably heard about. They're earned in Bermuda, where they're taxed at 0. So we need this to be, if you think there needs to be redistribution, somehow there has to be some kind of global compact. Achieving that seems difficult, to say the least. The second reason why it's actually quite difficult is that if you look at a majority of the societies that have actually moved towards more inequality, the direction of taxation, whether we're talking about income taxation or whether we're talking about wealth taxation, has been in the opposite direction. I mean, we've been through a major social upheaval in the United States. We've shut down the government, I believe, twice now, over raising the top marginal tax rate from 35 to 38%. Okay, so do you think we're going to get to 70 like they have in France? Okay. Now, let's also look at wealth taxation. Here, the record, particularly if I may say it, the Democratic Party is incredibly weak. How the Democratic Party lost this debate, it astonishes me. And you know, I don't know, maybe we have some strategies here. But really, the number of families that are actually subject to the estate tax is incredibly small. It's a little bit more than the 85 that I talked about, but it's not many more. And somehow the debate over estate taxation, which for a period of time, by the way, was zero. Okay, there was a period of time where the law lapsed and we didn't pass a new one. Okay, but a dramatic decline in the rates of wealth taxation, at least as measured by estate taxation. And this is again just for the folks too stupid to figure out how to avoid it. Nonetheless, has been again in the direction away from Piketty's argument, which is for higher levels of global wealth taxation. So policy is not moving in Piketty's direction despite this rise in inequality. It's moving towards lower and lower estate tax rates. And that's true actually when you look internationally as well. So finally, here's a broader program put together by former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, now teaching at Berkeley, with a broader set of things, including, of course, the Piketty things. There's lots of words here about higher taxes and so on. You'd also probably want to throw the minimum wage in here. There are all sorts of things that you can do to make incomes at the lower quintile higher. Minimum wage is one of them, fair wages that have been passed in cities like San Francisco and so on, to make sure that fast food workers can earn a livable wage. These all move in the right direction. Perhaps Mr. Cohen's going to talk about this in his talk. Wall Street is certainly part of the story, and this is certainly why the Occupy movement also picked up on this theme after the financial crisis. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to the comments from the rest of the panelists.
Oh boy, gotta have the picture. Thank goodness. Okay, I don't have any slides, so I'm happy to stand in the dark. It's in my DNA, I think. I'm not an economist. I'm not a Harvard Law School graduate. I'm just a humble former Wall Street banker turned journalist, turned back to journalism. I started my career as a journalist, then went to Wall Street, and then for the last 10 years I've been liberated from Wall Street and have written 4 books and countless articles. So my question, my focus is why do we, as a society, why are we allowing what Bruce described to happen? I mean, we all know it's happening. The question is why, in my mind, have we allowed it to happen? We are allowing it to happen, or it is happening to us and we're not doing anything about it. And I wonder that, especially in light of what happened in 2007 and 2008 when the Wall Street wizards basically caused our economy to crash and burn, and caused economies around the world to crash and burn. And out of the result of that, you would have thought there would have been some serious changes to have taken place, that people would have realized, as I do, that as a former banker and now writer about Wall Street and other topics, that the architecture of Wall Street is actually completely morally and financially bankrupt. both morally and financially bankrupt. That was very clear to me in 2007. It should have been very clear to the rest of the world and after Bear Stearns collapsed in March of 2008. And if it wasn't clear then, it should have been clear to everybody after Lehman failed in September of 2008, as well as did AIG, Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, Wachovia, and Washington Mutual, and basically Goldman Sachs would have gone down the tubes as well. And basically the Wall Street financial structure as we know it, and have been sort of been rammed down our throats for generations about how wonderful all these companies are, would have been gone out of business if left to their own devices. The question is why didn't that happen? And why are we okay with that? I don't know why we're okay with it. I mean, Bruce, you referenced the Occupy Wall Street movement. I thought that was a pathetic excuse for a movement. It was an interesting idea that failed completely and should not, in my mind, be held up as anything more than a total disaster. A failure to seize a real moment when change was afoot and were able to do nothing about it, primarily because they failed to educate themselves about the way Wall Street worked. I, for one, offered to conduct a seminar. I went down there on many occasions. Conduct a seminar, free of charge, whatever, to explain the way Wall Street really works and what they needed to ask for in terms of changes. And unfortunately, there was no interest in that. And so the movement fizzled, and I think is nothing more than a footnote. Instead, what we got was a movement, a very powerful movement by the powers that be to restore the status quo as quickly as possible on Wall Street. And what does that mean? Well, we can look in any number of places. We can look in Tim Geithner's new book. We can look in Henry Paulson's book. We can look in Ben Bernanke's book when it comes out. We don't have to look in books. We can look at just what the Fed did, what the Federal Reserve Banks did, what the Treasury did. Instead of trying to fix the architecture on Wall Street, a business model that relied on using other people's money to finance their short-term borrowings, which is a complete disaster of an idea. In other words, it allowed creditors, short-term creditors, to vote every night about whether to do business with these Wall Street firms. Why they allowed that to happen. If you want to know why Bear Stearns failed, or why Lehman Brothers failed, or why Merrill Lynch failed, or why Morgan Stanley almost failed, the reason is because they were financing their own businesses by borrowing short-term money, overnight money, from big pools of capital, using as collateral the assets on their balance sheet that were rapidly losing value. So what happened was, Bear Stearns, for instance, was using the mortgage-backed securities that it was manufacturing and no longer able to sell as collateral for overnight loans from Fidelity and Federated in all of 2007 and 2008. And the reason Bear Stearns failed, and the reason the others failed as well, is because in a very short period of time, these banks no longer could get financing from the Fidelities and Federateds of the world. They basically decided that they were no longer going to use as collateral for these loans that they had been making, these crazy securities that had been building up on their balance sheet. And even though Bear Stearns had $18 billion in cash on their balance sheet, they needed $75 billion of cash every day to operate their business. And the balance they got from these overnight short-term lenders who just decided in March of 2008 they weren't going to finance them anymore. So that's it. They pulled the plug. They made the stupid mistake of allowing these lenders to decide their fate. And the irony is, of course, these smart bankers would never, of course, tell any of their clients to do this, but they themselves did it because of their desire to pay as little as possible for their financing and increase their profitability and therefore their bonuses, which leads to the second problem that exists on Wall Street that resulted in this crisis that is not changed by anything the Fed did or any legislation that's come out of it, and that is the desire of the people on Wall Street to get big bonuses using other people's money and have absolutely no accountability for their behavior, which is a great work if you can get it. But unfortunately, the rest of us have to be accountable for what we do. But on Wall Street, they are not accountable for what they do. They are not using their own money. They are using other people's money to take big risks to whatever it is. If you're a mortgage-backed security salesman, you get paid to manufacture and sell mortgage-backed securities, and that's what you're going to do all day long until you can't do it anymore. And that's exactly what happened in 2006 and 2007. These people would buy up mortgages from people who shouldn't have been gotten them in the first place. They would package them into securities, rated AAA by the rating agencies that were paid by Wall Street for those ratings, and then they sold them off as investments all over the world. And then they got their big bonus at the end of the year and say, look at how much revenue I generated, and I deserve a big bonus. And that's a great business model if you work on Wall Street. The problem is, it's not good for the rest of us. And you would have thought that the Fed and the Treasury and the New York Fed would have changed that. But instead, actually, they didn't. They didn't do anything to change that behavior. They've done nothing to change the compensation system on Wall Street, and they've done nothing to change Wall Street's reliance on short-term secured financing, which gives creditors a vote every night whether to keep doing business with Wall Street. So it's the most inane thing I've ever heard of. So we know the roots of the problem. They are obvious. If they are obvious to a journalist like me who used to work on Wall Street, then you would think they would be obvious to the people who are actually making decisions about what the regulation should say, or what the Fed's policy should be, or what the Treasury should allow to happen. But in fact, because Wall Street has its hooks in the people who make those decisions, they do exactly what Wall Street wants them to do. If you think that the Dodd-Frank law, that new 2,300-page law, that is supposedly re-regulating Wall Street, does anything to re-regulate Wall Street, well, then there's a bridge, between Manhattan and Brooklyn that we can talk about negotiating the sale of, because it's absolutely nothing has changed. That piece of legislation is 2,300 pages of obfuscation. It does nothing to change the behavior on Wall Street that caused this crisis. And then you look at the so-called Volcker rule that came out of this, which is preventing Wall Street from supposedly making proprietary trades, which had nothing to do with the cause of the crisis. In fact, as I outline in my Goldman book, it was the proprietary trade that Goldman put on in December of 2006 to bet against the mortgage market that saved Goldman Sachs from going down the tubes. Now, you may not like Goldman Sachs. You may think that their behavior is morally repugnant for betting against the mortgage market at the same time that it was manufacturing and selling mortgage-backed securities at par to investors all over the world, and we can have that discussion. But nevertheless, they were at least smart enough to realize that something was happening wrong, and they were going to make a big bet against it, and they made enough money to save that firm, as opposed to having it go down the tubes like all the rest of them did. So the proprietary trading had nothing to do with this crisis, and so outlawing it is meaningless, and in fact outlawing it is the exactly wrong thing to do. I used to think Paul Volcker made a lot of sense, and he did make a lot of sense when he was shooting at the Dodd-Frank law from the sidelines. But the moment that he stood with President Obama in the White House and talked about this Volcker rule and preventing proprietary trading was the moment that he lost his mind, and he was completely off in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, we've wasted a lot of time and lawyers, $1,000 an hour lawyers' money to put together this so-called Volcker rule and then to make sure that it can never be implemented. And I also note that the Dodd-Frank law will never be implemented in full, because the $1,000 an hour lawyers on Wall Street are basically spending their time to strip out any meaningless part of it. Of course, there is no meaningless part of it, but there's nevertheless wasting their time stripping out whatever that might have been. Then you look to the Fed. So you've got no response from Congress to anything that might change the behavior in Wall Street. And then you look to the real culprit, which is the Federal Reserve. And you ask yourself, well, doesn't the Federal Reserve work for the American people? Shouldn't the Federal Reserve's policies be those that might work for the benefit of the American people? But then you have to figure out who really owns the Fed. Who does the Fed work for? And it's not as easy a question as that sounds. There's not a real easy answer. No, not many people really understand who the Fed works for, but as best as I can figure out, the Fed works for the Wall Street banks. And they merely, the Fed merely, everything, when you see it in that context, the Fed is owned by Wall Street. Literally, they own shares in the Federal Reserve banks. It was set up 100 years ago by Henry Goldman, one of the founders of Goldman Sachs, literally designed by Henry Goldman to benefit Goldman Sachs and the other big Wall Street banks. Then you understand the Fed's policies. They have nothing to do with making life any better for the American people. In fact, just the opposite. So what has the Fed done? In addition to making trillions of dollars of capital available to Wall Street at very low rates, so that supposedly Wall Street could then make those loans available to the rest of us, which of course you'll know never happened. In addition to that, they've started this quantitative easing program, which is Wall Street gobbledygook for buying up $85 billion of bonds on a monthly basis and driving down the interest rates on those bonds, driving up their price because yields on bonds trade in inverse proportion to their price. And so when the price of these bonds goes up because of the artificial demand brought by the Fed to $85 billion a month, which is a lot of money, the Fed's balance sheet has expanded from $800 billion of assets to $4 trillion worth of assets. That has the counterintuitive effect of driving down the cost of capital to levels that you think might be attractive to borrowers. Unfortunately, what it does is it makes the cost of capital free to Wall Street. They can go, the Wall Street banks that can go to the Fed window and borrow for nothing, or can get our deposits from us. We give our money to banks. Have you looked at the income, have you looked at the interest rate on your bank statements lately? I'm sure you all have. You have enough, a group of you seem to have enough gray hair like I do to know that we rely on our savings. And unfortunately, people who rely on savings have been getting screwed by the Fed, if I may use that word. The interest rate on your savings is as close to zero as it could possibly be. And on your checking account, it's even less. So the Fed's policies have driven down interest rates to such a level that savers are getting nothing, and the banks are benefiting tremendously because they make money from money, and they are getting us to give them our money for free. So, for instance, JP Morgan Chase has something like $2 trillion worth of deposits. That is money that it uses to make money from. What did it pay for that $2 trillion of deposits? Nothing. We gave it to them for free. Now, you got to ask ourselves, why did we do that? I don't know the answer collectively why we did that, but the Fed has driven down interest rates intentionally to benefit the banks, not us. Savers get screwed. The American people get screwed. Banks benefit. No other company on the face, no other industry on the face of the earth doesn't have to pay for its cost of goods sold. GM has to pay to make a car, has to pay for glass, steel, aluminum, plastic, rubber, whatever it makes, wires, light bulbs. It has to pay for the cost of those things and to put that in the car, and then the price that it charges us reflects, theoretically, those costs. Again, I'm not an economist and I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a journalist. And I can tell you for a fact that no other industry on the face of the earth, except for the big banks, doesn't have to pay for its cost of goods sold. That's insanity. And those policies are designed by the Fed to benefit Wall Street. So you've got no response from Congress, no meaningful response to change the behavior of people on Wall Street. You've got the Fed actively working for Wall Street through its policies by driving down interest rates to near zero so they can get their capital for free and they make money on money and we get screwed. Absolutely. Anybody who's trying to save money, do the right thing, gets screwed. And you've got to ask yourself, why does that happen? Why was it the decision of these powerful people to reestablish the status quo as quickly as possible on Wall Street? Well, I know the theory. The theory is, well, according to Tim Geithner and others, well, if we don't reestablish Wall Street in a functioning way, then, the rest of the economy will suffer even worse. It would have been worse. Trust us, it would have been worse had we not saved these big banks and have not designed these policies to refloat their boats. And as a result, you're better off than you would have been. In fact, what happened is they're better off. They're better off than they would have been. They still got their big bonus. The rest of us are struggling. and living with the numbers that Bruce showed on the charts. And the question, I'm just dumbfounded as to why we put up with this. Why Occupy Wall Street was such a pathetic excuse for a movement that would have made a difference. You know, in April of 2011, when I was on the Jon Stewart Show talking about my Goldman book, I did say I don't understand why people aren't in the streets. The Occupy movement didn't happen until September of 2011. I didn't understand why people were not out in the streets. And I still do not understand why people are not out in the streets protesting this. Why do we put up with this kind of inequality? It's a mystery, I can't answer it. But I also just want to mention before I finish, because I don't have the answers, I just can just point out what's really happening and ask questions. Why is, people have said to me, well, why did you write 3 books about Wall Street and then write this book about the Duke lacrosse scandal? Well, the interesting thing is it's not really all that much different. First of all, Duke is not that much different than Goldman Sachs. I mean, they all have their strange morality, they have their secrets, they have their myths, they have their capital accounts. Goldman's happens to be 72 billion, Duke's is 9 billion. You know, they have their strange behaviors and their secret societies, basically. I mean, Goldman Sachs is a public company, but I assure you it's a secret society. Duke University, which is my alma mater, is a secret society. So are all these elite universities. And what I found in this incident is the ability, as I say, the power of the elite, the ability of, you know, whether these kids did what they were accused of doing or not, we'll never know. Okay, despite what the narrative is that everybody wants us to believe that these kids were angels and did nothing wrong, because that's a convenient narrative at this point, and that the white angels did nothing wrong and the black, you know, woman accuser was making this whole thing up. The fact of the matter is that there was no trial. Justice was subverted by the deep-pocketed, wealthy families who hired defense attorneys to exploit every mistake that was made by the prosecutor and by the woman who accused these boys of raping her. The fact remains that this is not the way the justice system is supposed to work. A prosecutor, if he believes in the evidence that is presented to him and decides a crime has been committed, takes that evidence to a grand jury, gets an indictment, that prosecutor is entitled to bring that case to trial and let a jury of these kids' peers decide whether or not they believe him or her or not, whether the evidence is sufficient to convict these people and find them guilty